I'm, as I said before, I'm really looking forward to hearing your presentation. What I know about your work is that it works at the junction between science education and educational assessment. And your ideas are fundamental in working with formative assessment and also trying to tease out or show how educators can work with assessment also when we do inquiry-based teaching. So this is something that I hope that you in some way or other at least might touch upon in your work today. The title of your presentation that you're going to be sharing with us is Preparing Assessment-Capable Teachers. So it's about how teachers can use assessment and how you can support the development of teachers in order to use assessment. And you also had put the subtitle of a global need. So I'm imagining that there is a global or an international perspective on this. But Christine, welcome, and we look forward to hearing your presentation. So you're welcome to grab control of the PowerPoint or whatever you're using now, and go ahead.
Okay, hopefully you can see my screen.
We can.
Good. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me today. Can I say before I start, I've prepared far too much for half an hour, so I will try and pick the best bits of it as we move through. Part of the reason why I prepared too much is the people I'm working on with this, I've got a big meeting with them this evening, and I think part of what I'm going to be doing with them was in my head when I was preparing it. But let's get going with it anyway. So preparing assessment-capable teachers, this really started this idea when I was reading quite a lot of work by people by researchers in Australia, particularly people at the Catholic University in Brisbane, where they were given for the whole of Australia the job of trying to work out how do we actually prepare teachers for being assessment capable, but also how do we try and in some way measure or monitor that. So I was very interested in their work, and this was something like 10 years ago. At the same time, I was fortunate enough to be able to go to a seminar, sorry, not a seminar, a conference on assessment for learning that was held in Brisbane. And colleagues that I've worked with before from New Zealand and Canada, as well as from Australia, were there. And we've actually been, for the last 8 years, managed to get some funding, have been working on this idea of how do we do that. I'm not saying we've got the answer, but we've got some way in exploring this particular area. And I think it's quite important. Over the past 20 years, there's been changes going on. So when I started doing work on formative assessment with Paul Black and Dylan William, we were stressing formative assessment, which moved into the pedagogy we now call assessment for learning. But there still was really quite a strong influence of summative assessment. That's not to say that summative assessment is bad. It's not the evil side of assessment. It's just that getting that balance, particularly in classrooms and in schools, where we put together both the summative purpose of assessment and the formative purpose of assessment to support learning is important. And teachers need to get hold of that and need to develop that, particularly in their early years. And some of the research that's out there is not very positive in suggesting that is actually happening. So we see here that assessment-informed teaching tends to get more summative as they leave pre-service courses and move into their actual first few years of teaching. And that's something of a concern. Why is that? What is actually happening to actually cause that? And it's possibly something to do with accountability, but it's certainly to do with context. And that's one of the things we've kept in our vision as we've moved through this. Certainly, one of the things that we've been thinking about is what are teachers' repertoires in terms of assessment, because it's not, most assessment is based on what has gone before, on the history and culture of what's gone before. I frequently tell my pre-service teachers and my master's students and so on that, assessment tends to be quite conservative. It doesn't tend to change very much. People want to stick with how they were assessed as they're moving through the system. So it's very, very hard to persuade, certainly in the UK, government ministers, education ministers in our government to change. They want it to be as it was, because that's how they were measured, and they've obviously done well within the system. So there's that culture there that's quite conservative, holding it back. There's also a lot more to do now. So certainly my pre-service teachers going into schools, it's not just about taking a test and giving it to a student, marking that test and putting those results on a spreadsheet. There's much more to do now, because there's, it's being used, assessment information is being used to assess courses, to assess teachers, and so on. And certainly here in the UK, for the last 15 years or so, we've actually had what's called league tables, where schools have been compared on examination results. And that certainly has an effect on what goes on. And then at the same time, as we move into the future, teaching has changed. So, we tend to use more computers in classrooms. Certainly in some countries, they're tending to do much more outside work, so working outside the classroom and using informal types of education, relating it to what goes on in classrooms. And all of these different contexts that's created through these changes requires teachers to think about, so how do I assess? How do I make judgments in this system? How do I judge quality? But at the same time, how do I use the assessment evidence that I'm collecting from this new way of working to actually help the learning of those students as they move forward and become citizens of the 21st century? So, why am I not moving on? Oh, there we go. So I just want you to think for a moment about how ready are new teachers in your context, so in Denmark and Norway, and wherever else people are from who are here today, in the assessment that is to come. Are they already there? Now, I've put the picture at the top of inquiry, because certainly in the UK, despite all the wonderful EU projects that went on for more than 10 years looking at developing inquiry, and we certainly were involved in some of those, we still don't use assessment evidence that goes on in practical work. In fact, students' capability in practical work in England and Wales is judged by written questions on an examination paper. And I've just had a project for the last 3 years that's looked at, is that a valid way to do it? And how do students perform differently if they actually have mainly class practicals, mainly demonstrations of practicals, or watch practicals on video? But I'm not reporting on that today. But certainly, our teachers, if it suddenly was we're going to go back to assess inquiry, very much as we did in the Assist Me project and the Sales project, those 2 EU FP7 projects that I was involved in, our teachers in England, apart from the ones that were on the project, wouldn't really know what to do. They haven't really looked at that. So I would say on the top picture there, that they're not very ready for it. Most of them are not very ready for it. A few might be somewhat ready. I just want you to think for a minute, and maybe you might discuss this when you have your breakout groups, just how prepared are your teachers for new forms of assessment? Equally, assessment that's to do with digital technology. Again, I would say on the whole, our teachers are not ready for that. They do use computers and things, but mainly it's actually taking what are pencil and paper tests and putting them through into various programs, or using various programs. So maybe they get the data, the evidence out quicker, and that might be having an effect of what goes on in the classroom. But they're not into new ways of doing it, such as, in science, maybe we would want them to enter a virtual environment and do inquiries, and then we could actually then assess what was going on within that. Our teachers are in the UK, I would say, are not even on the horizon with that one. And again, you might want to think about that for Denmark, and also other forms of new assessment ideas and new ways of teaching that might be coming in your country. So, I don't know why I'm not moving on. Let me just come out and go in again. Ooh. My screen's frozen, Katrina. I don't know why. Sorry. I'm going to stop and restart. Yeah. Sorry about that. So where was I? I was here.
Yes.
All right, there we go. So as I said, this started when I was talking with colleagues 10 years ago at this Assessment for Learning conference. And I've been working with Chris DeLuca, who's from Canada, Jill Willis, who's from Australia, and Bronwyn Cowie on this ever since. And these other people are collaborators at our various universities who've joined in. And what we thought we'd do, because we know that context has an effect on assessment and has an effect on what goes on within the classroom, particularly with classroom assessment. And so here, the first thing we did was to think, well, why don't we look across our 4 countries? There are differences and similarities between us. Let's have a look at how they are doing. Because whenever we talked about it with one another, we all said, you know, our teachers are really keen to do formative assessment. They're using assessment for learning, but some of them aren't using that evidence to inform what goes on in the classroom. And that was pretty common across all 4 of the countries. Maybe New Zealand a little bit evidence has been used a little bit more than possibly in the other 3 countries. But it was and we talked for a lot about, because 3 of us are involved with pre-service education courses, about what are we doing within our universities and what are we doing within our schools, particularly our partnership schools who are helping train our teachers in terms of helping them develop this repertoire they need for assessment. And we used as a framework Bernstein's ideas. So we took his ideas of horizontal knowledge, which is what's the ideas they're picking up locally from the classroom, from what's going on in their schools, and from the social situation of what either their mentors or the teachers in the schools were doing. At the same time, thinking about how is that actually working alongside or in tandem with what was going on in terms of national assessments or regional assessments. So, you know, in most cases, that was more codified official policy and standards and theory. So it's very much looking across this as we started out. And we started, first of all, by looking at the courses that we taught in the 4 countries. What is quite interesting there is, if you look at the second line there, is that, you know, the amount of learning that goes on the university course is pretty similar across the 4 countries. New Zealand, a little bit more, Canada, a little bit less, but around the sort of 60s, 70s idea of what was going on. That was 60% or so said through lectures and tutorials in my university course. If you look at other things that's going on, so through through school-based professional development, again, New Zealand's a little bit more, Australia this time's a little bit less, but around the similar thing. But you then come to through school-based professional development and through practical experience where I have been observed or assessed. Now, we haven't got results for Canada for that one, but you'll see there's a marked difference. We're starting to see some differences that go on in terms of the context that they're working in. And our thinking was to look at that and to see whether that had an effect on the way that teachers, particularly teachers coming into profession, develop their assessment capabilities that was going on. We felt very much that maybe their assessment literacy was probably pretty similar across the 4 countries because they had similar inputs from the universities. But then when they actually went on practicum, on teaching practice, or when they started working within the schools as new teachers, maybe something was happening that was changing what was going on in terms of how they viewed assessment and how they used assessment in their classrooms. So looking across the 4 countries, there obviously are similarities, as I said. You know, we all come from a pretty similar curriculum to start off with because of the Commonwealth and so on. All of the 4 countries that we're looking at are trying to make teachers active in student assessment and also students active in their assessment. So they're all very much wanting to push a formative approach to assessment and to get teachers to look at the importance of formative assessment. All of them had some sort of testing in the senior years, and all of them had teacher assessment preparation in their universities. And a certain amount of accountability was there, but that did vary. Although it was similar, that there was accountability there, that did vary somewhat across the 4 countries. And when we looked at whether assessment was seen by these teachers as being sort of a separate thing from being embedded in the teaching or learning cycle. We're imagining that if they got a very formative approach to their actual approach to assessment, it would be embedded. We found that it was actually less. It was separate, much more in Australia. Quite a lot within England, and I was very surprised by that, because we'd done the initial work on assessment for learning when we did all the work in the turn of the millennium, looking at formative assessment inside the black box, whereas in New Zealand, it was actually much more embedded. And we started to see this difference and to think about it. And so we thought, right, we need to explore this further. We also were aware that the accountability side of things, the contexts were different across the countries. So in England, we've got very much a focus on standardized assessment. In Australia, it's much more about accountability and reporting to parents, whereas in Canada and New Zealand, there was much more to do. Assessment was considered very much more from a student viewpoint, from a more social viewpoint, because we thought that our colleagues in Canada and New Zealand reported this was because of the higher emphasis on student diversity and differentiation. And I know myself, because I've done quite a lot of work in New Zealand with my colleague Bronwyn Cowie, that they look at assessment very seriously in European New Zealand, with European New Zealand students compared to Maori and Pacifica students, and work quite a lot on equity within assessment, where I would say, even though we've got much more diverse classrooms in the UK than we had 20 years ago, that's not really one of the ideas that comes immediately to mind for many of our teachers. In fact, many of our teachers think we should all be assessed using the same test. It doesn't matter. I had a teacher the other day who said to me, I don't mind what the test is, just give them all the same questions, then we can see how they do. In other words, in the UK, many of our teachers are looking at assessment being used for competition and for ranking students, whereas in New Zealand, it's much more about, are the judgments we're making appropriate in terms of trying to find out really what these students can do and what these students need. And yet, I would say that in the UK, where I work, teachers are very keen to try and use assessment for learning. But when you actually try and put the two together, so when you try and bridge the gap between summative and formative assessment, sometimes there's somewhat of a dilemma, and they don't really know which way to go. And because of this, we started to use a tool that was developed by Chris DeLuca. And here it's called the Approaches to a Classroom Assessment Inventory, what we call the ACI. And the web link at the top will allow you to get there and to, if you want yourself to have a go using the ACI, or to use it with your student teachers or any of the teachers you're working with. It's actually on the internet, and we'll actually come back with some data on what it's saying about you. It's now being used quite a lot within lots of countries, but particularly for this project. So basically what the ACI has are 5 scenarios. I've only put up scenario 1 here. So scenario 1 is, you give your class a paper and pencil summative unit test. So you're giving them a test at the end of a unit. And you've made accommodations and modifications for students who might struggle with it, for special educational needs students, so for identified learners. So you try to make the best test that you can. And what you find is in your class of 24 students, 16 of the 24 students fail. They don't do well on it at all. And what we asked the teachers to do, it's a questionnaire online. What we asked them to do was to say, which of the following things would they be highly likely to do or less likely to do if this actually happened in their classrooms? And this is not all of them. Here's 4 of the things that were on that sheet. There's about 9 or 10 different things we asked them to look at and say, are you highly likely to do this, or are you highly unlikely to do this? So, are you just going to carry on? So you just record those results that 16 failed and 8 passed. And then just move on and hope that the next unit they do better? Are you going to disregard the test grade, reteach the material, So you think, you know, there's something wrong with the teaching that's gone on and the student learning, and retest the material using the same test. Are you going to do a separate test for maybe your students who've got special educational needs, those with exceptionalities? Because maybe that first test wasn't assessing what they could do, it was assessing maybe above the level that they could actually show good performance on. Or are you going to adjust student grades because you're going to actually put the marks they got for that particular test alongside the marks that you've been collecting or the grades you've been collecting for the work they've been doing in the classroom, so for the more formative assessment information. And teachers, or our pre-service teachers in our case, have to mark on that, are they going to be highly likely or highly unlikely on a 1 to 6 Likert scale. When we actually looked at this, and I'm moving really quickly now because of time, we actually found this in all cases, apart from the UK, we found that most of the teachers will have what we called a contemporary approach. That is, that they were, in general, putting a more formative approach ahead of using it for summative purposes. Interestingly, United Kingdom, where we think we're very good at formative assessment for learning, it was that more summative approach. And it really shocked me when I saw that. But then I thought of the way that some of my teachers that I work with and pre-service teachers work. And certainly we have been seeing that they've been using assessment for learning in a more summative way. So they've actually been doing things like giving oral feedback or written feedback rather than grades to students because I think it's better for them. But basically that oral feedback or written feedback has been helping students correct work, not to do it as was intended in the original formative assessment work we did on Inside the Black Box, where, you know, we want them to get students to rethink and revisit those ideas and to learn from it rather than to just correct things. And this is particularly so in science, so much so that when we looked at some of it, basically they were just trying to get them to write better answers, and they weren't necessarily using assessment to help children learn. So this was somewhat of a shock to me, and it's made us rethink how we are going to work with our teachers on our pre-service course. And also, you know, the other 3 countries were interested as well. So we've got this concept of some countries have a more traditional approach, that's a more summative approach, and some have a more contemporary approach. But that sort of difference of saying you're either this or that, we felt wasn't enough. It didn't actually help us enough know how we should change things on our pre-service courses. So I'm going to really quickly go through the last bit, and you might want to come back and ask me questions about this after you've had your breakout, but let's have a go. So we started coming up with a different framework. We knew that teachers assess differently within different subjects. So we had an epistemological section to it. And we knew that assessment also had quite an effect on people's emotions, both the teachers who were doing the assessments and the students who were performing on those assessments. And so we thought we needed to take that into consideration as well. We were really encouraged to do that by our New Zealand colleagues. We also thought that there was something to do with equity we needed to consider. And as I said, you know, in the UK, that wasn't something that I think was the foremost of teachers' minds. And so we need to think about that, particularly when we're talking about, you know, decolonizing the curriculum, which is a very big move within teaching in England. And then the 4th thing was the experiential. So what is the experience they have as they do, particularly their first few years, their pre-service years and their first few years of teaching? How is that affecting what we're now starting to call assessment capacity? And how we collected evidence on this to move our thinking forward was to use another tool that had been developed by one of Jill Willis's PhD students, which was basically an online diary. It's called Going OK. And they use it a lot in Australia because some of their teaching practice schools are, hundreds of miles away. It's not that they can visit the school because it's down the road or just the other side of the city. And so they use this diary quite a lot, just for general feedback from students. And we adapted it somewhat to start putting in, sometimes we put in assessment quotes and ask people to come back and to write about what that was about. So one, for example, I know we used was a quote from Gordon Stobart, who says, "Assessment maketh people." In other words, it really affects student identity and student self-efficacy and so on, and teachers' self-efficacy and identity. And we asked them to, comment on that. And other times we'd say, tell us about an assessment experience you've had this week, and how that's made you think again, either about assessment or about teaching or about learning. And so we've got, over the course of the teaching training, and some of these teacher training courses were 1 year, some 2 years, some 3-year courses, but we've got the data from that. I just want to show you a few just quickly so you get some sort of idea, because what we did was to go through that data and to look at some of the things they'd written to say, so how much of this is, would you say, fitted under the epistemological part of the assessment capacity, how much under the emotional, how much under the equity, and how much under experiential. So here's one teacher talking about how they feel. So it's an embodied assessment capacity as they move on. And what effect is it having on that? So you can see there's words there, like in the last sentence, I feel like I'm starting to approach it more effectively and hope to start reducing the time it's taking. So they're starting to experiment, but they realize it's taking time and that they're hoping to move forward with it. But you get a real feel for what they're trying to do and how that's affecting them. Here we see the ethical side. So they're talking about English as a second language learners, or they're talking about Indigenous people in their country. And they're asking, is this fair or not? So they're starting to challenge, is the way we're assessing fair or not? Here we see the epistemic, the subject one. So, are we actually assessing what we need to do? There's certainly been a lot as we've moved forward with this project, and particularly with our pre-service teachers, where particularly our science pre-service teachers are saying, are our summative assessments actually assessing all the capabilities we want of students, or are we just assessing student science content? And, are we looking enough at things like working scientifically, etc.? And here you see on the project, this is a quote from one of the Canada ones, where, are we really looking at 21st century skills, creativity, and so on? That's evident in the new maths assessment. And, should we be doing that more? And here we've got the experiential side. So, what are they getting from their classrooms, particularly from practicum and from their mentors, in terms of the input that they're giving, and whether that is actually helping develop their assessment capacity, or maybe it's reshaping their assessment capabilities and get them to use it in a different way. And this might be why they're taking gradually this more summative approach to assessment, particularly the UK pre-service teachers. So we've been looking over this 8 years, and this has really only been in the last 2 years we started to fathom out what's going on. Not looking at assessment literacy, which was very much in vogue to look at, say, 10 years ago. And not only at assessment capability, which is the work that's been going on, particularly, as I say, at the Catholic University of Brisbane, but more at assessment capacity. How do our courses, and how does the evidence that we're collecting, both from our courses, but also from our actual pre-service teachers themselves, and from some of our mentors in our partnership schools, how is this affecting their capacity to learn about, adapt, and innovate assessment, both across context systems and relationships over time? And some of the things we've come out with so far is that important areas to think about is to think about learning being orientated about deep and long-term learning within this area, about how can they adapt, and do we help them be able to adapt what's going on and be innovative, or are they accepting what goes on in their school, or what they're being shown by their school, or what has gone on before, particularly how they can be responsive to both the micro and macro contextual factors, and how this might affect what goes on, but also taking a more multi-relational shape multi-relational actual actions as they actually move forward. So this has led us to think of various questions. I'm not going to go through these now, but what we do is sort of say is now start thinking about our course in terms of what's going on, and we try and work with our pre-service teachers so they look at the disciplinary knowledge, the epistemological knowledge. We look with them at how does that make them feel, and how does it make the students feel, and how does that then affect the sort of choices we make and the judgments we make about which tools to use, how to give feedback, and what to allow students to take more active agency within. Particularly in UK and Australia, I would say we look much more, is this fair and socially just? They're already doing that to quite a large extent in New Zealand and Canada. But the final thing is, what events and practices have persuaded me to think this way? And we've learned a lot, and we're just starting to publish a book that's looking at this, about what has gone on within particularly the practicum schools, and particularly the first few years as these new teachers start teaching, what has gone on in their schools, which has led them to maybe do assessment a bit different to maybe what they thought that they would do when they first started teaching, when they were pre-service teachers and started their first job. And we're looking at it very much from this sort of viewpoint. This is where we are at the moment. We're saying that there's potential for all four of these capabilities to be developed during the course and in those first few years when they're early career teachers. And it will be what we want to try and do. What we want to try and do is to get the pre-service teachers to be more active. If they think about it using the four ideas within our framework, maybe they'll go and grasp and look at particular areas as they're moving forward, and not just think there's just one way of doing it and one ladder to go up that wall or to go on that journey. And there are implications, and this will be my final slide before I give you your question. There are implications if we're going to do this. One is that we think it's really important, if people are going to look at what goes on in terms of their pre-service courses, to actually have a look at what goes on in other contexts, whether that's different areas of your country or maybe different countries, because sometimes you can't see what is part of your context until you look outside. And that certainly was the case for us. I would have said our teachers are really good at formative assessment, and summative assessment is having an effect on them doing that. But now I see that summative assessment is having a huge effect on how they actually carry out their formative practices, even though they are finding out much more about their students and they are sharing much more with their students. They still are using summative assessment to make judgments about students and to make decisions about students far more than they're using formative assessment evidence to inform future learning. We also think it's important that we get new teachers to acknowledge that assessment can be messy. They all think that it's objective and straightforward, and showing them that it can be very subjective and that it can be messy, and you need to think about a range of things when you're deciding on the tools to use and how you use them is important. And I think 3 is probably the most important one that we've looked at, trying to develop these opportunities for reflexivity within our pre-service course, where it's not just knowing what to do, but more helping them generate understanding and ways forward. Especially, in a world that's where we get increasing polarization of opinions at times. And looking at this in a very collaborative approach with our partnership schools, and we're all trying to work on that now, and that's probably an area we need to work on more. But also looking at the skills they need to develop. So, for example, they need much more data literacy, all of the teachers in all 4 countries, to really understand, if you are going to collect large-scale data, what does that mean? And particularly with things like reinterpreting, say, for science, the PISA 2015 data. When I've done that with science teachers, they've looked again at what they thought were the implications for science and science assessment. As we've looked at, did the way that actually was done really assess students' inquiry skills? So, gone slightly over, and I do apologise for that. But I've got a question for you. I'm sure there's lots in what I've just said that you maybe want to talk about anyway, and talk about what's the situation like in Denmark, and how do your pre-service teachers respond to your courses, and what's the effect of them being on practicum and so on. But I've got a question for you. If a pre-service teacher said to you, I don't want to fail that student, he tried so hard and has shown me he can do the work in class, how would you approach actually talking with them? Would you take a more embodied approach, a more ethical approach, or an epistemic approach, or an experiential approach? And I think it'll be interesting in your group to see whether you take a similar approach or a different approach, because this will actually be testing out just how useful or not our framework might be. So I'm going to stop talking at that point. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris. This was really, really interesting. And I'm impressed by what you managed to actually share with us in 30 minutes. So fabulous.
Sorry, I realized it was far too much, but
yeah. No, I don't think so. I think it was perfect, actually. So thank you very much.
People are very welcome to the slides, and I have put a few notes on some of the slides anyway as I was working through this. So
yeah. No, it's super. It's so clear and very, very well based. So thank you so much. Now, Katrine, I think you're going to put us in breakout rooms, and the reason we do the breakout rooms is for people to be able to talk in Danish if they want about this your presentation, and then we will come back with and have a questions and answers with you, and we will ask the breakout room groups to also report what their decision is, or what they think they would what they would choose of the dimensions that you are suggesting that we work with. So the task is for the groups to try to tackle this question of, if you were mentoring a pre-service teacher, what would you which of the dimensions would you have focus on in a reflexive conversation? And Katrine, are you ready with the groups?
Yeah. So I'll see you in 8 minutes, right?
Yeah, exactly. Perfect.
Right. Bye.